Welcome back. In this lecture, we will continue our survey of the circulatory system in the head and neck as we focus on the venous circulation there. As with the arterial circulation, we will locate and identify the major veins, including the external and internal jugulars. So let's get started. Now I'm sure you've heard the adage, what goes up must come down, or what goes around comes around, or what goes in must come out. Okay, I know prairie dogs don't really sound like that. So enough of the cliches. By now you understand that oxygenated blood comes into the tissues, and that by way of your arterial circulation. By contrast, deoxygenated blood leaves the tissues, and that by way of your venous circulation. What goes in must come out. Now you know all about the arterial circulation of the head and neck from the last lecture. So this lecture is all about the venous circulation. Now there are a few caveats to consider with regard to the venous circulation of the head and neck. First, arterial circulation brings oxygenated blood into the tissues, whereas venous circulation takes bad blood out of the tissues. That is, venous circulation works counter to, or in the reverse direction of, arterial circulation. Second, because venous circulation is the reverse of arterial circulation, venous circulation starts at the lesser fleas and works backwards, as it were, to the big fleas. It looks something like this if we use our conventional flow chart. Whereas 3. Arterial circulation is quite specific in its delivery of oxygenated blood, venous circulation is quite indiscriminate. Now, I pondered long and hard to come up with some sort of example to illustrate this last point, so bear with me here. I thought about the delivery of clean water to and the removal of wastewater from your house. Fresh, clean water coming into your house is like arterial circulation. Now recall that arteries transport good blood from your heart to your tissues. So the big flea in this scenario is the reservoir that you see here. The clean water then travels to your municipal pumping station. That's the little flea. From there it gets pumped to your neighborhood and eventually to your house, the lesser flea. Now once it reaches your house, the clean water is delivered to various rooms and appliances like your kitchen sink, your bathroom, your dishwasher, and probably a dozen other specific areas of your house. Those are the still lesser fleas, or ad infinitum. The major point here is that the clean water, in other words oxygenated blood, is very specific as to its destination. Compare that now to your venous circulation. So after the clean water gets used by you and your various family members, it becomes wastewater. Now the system of drain pipes that collects your wastewater does not differentiate shower wastewater from kitchen sink wastewater from dishwasher wastewater. It's all just wastewater. Your particular community's wastewater collection system, again, does not differentiate your wastewater from that of every home in your neighborhood, or from every facility in your town or city. All of this wastewater mixes together in these large wastewater transfer pipes, or little fleas. These larger transfer pipes then deliver all of that nondescript wastewater to the municipal wastewater treatment facility, or big flea. The major point here is that the wastewater, in other words your deoxygenated blood, is not specific at all as to its source. In other words, wastewater is wastewater is wastewater, or bad blood is bad blood is bad blood. One note here, if it looks to you as though there is some overlap in the images to the flowchart, that's intentional on my part. Because drainage of deoxygenated blood is nonspecific, there is some blurring of the line, if you will, between the fleas. So with that concept of venous circulation in mind, let's now check out the veins of the head and neck. Now your venous circulation largely parallels your arterial circulation. We see this best exemplified in the extremities. However, this is an okay place to begin, as we do see some parallelism in the way of the major vessels servicing the head and neck, namely the external and internal carotids on the arterial side and the external and internal jugulars on the venous side. Now, a couple of lectures ago, you will recall, I showed you this illustration of the vessels of the aortic arch. Your aortic arch, then, is right here. Also recall that the left common carotid artery here ascends directly from the aortic arch. Now remember that the situation is a little different on the right side. That is, the right common carotid artery here ascends from this vessel, which arises from the aortic arch. And do you remember the name of this artery? That's right, that's the brachiocephalic artery. So the situation on the venous circulation side is very similar. That is, both the internal and external jugular veins drain into this vessel. This is the subclavian vein, so named because it travels under the collarbone or clavicle. Now the subclavian vein then drains into the brachiocephalic vein right here. So this arrangement is the same for both left and right sides. The left and right brachiocephalic veins then drain into the superior vena cava. That's your big flea, which in turn delivers deoxygenated blood from the head and neck back to the heart. And by the way, here is the inferior vena cava, which services the torso and lower extremities. So if we put this into flowchart form, then it looks like this. Remember that the superior vena cava is your big flea. Both the external and internal jugulars drain into the subclavian vein. The subclavian, in turn, drains into the brachiocephalic vein, and the brachiocephalic vein drains, of course, into the superior vena cava. And once again, you will find this flowchart in the resources section for this lecture. So, as we did with the carotids, too, we shall identify the divisions and subdivisions of the jugulars, beginning with the external jugular. Now remember that your venous circulation flows contrary to your arterial circulation. As a result, we must start tracing venous circulation at the smallest flea and work our way to the big flea. Now remember that the big flea in the case of venous circulation is the superior vena cava. So there are three small veins that drain the superficial tissues of the head. We have the temporal, servicing the tissues of the side of the head. We have the maxillary, servicing those tissues and structures associated with the maxilla. And then we have the occipital, draining, obviously, the area of the base of the head. Now, all of these vessels drain. Remember, we are referring to deoxygenated blood here into the external jugular vein. Again, a note. There is a little vein that some resources reference here between these veins and the external jugular. It's called the retromandibular vein. Now, you'll see it on the illustration in a moment. In reality, both the temporal and the maxillary veins drain into the retromandibular vein. The small vein then drains into the external jugular. I mention it here as you may be using a reference book that makes mention of the retromandibular vein, or you may be taking a live human anatomy course concurrent with this course, and your instructor will or may have mentioned the retromandibular vein. For the purposes of this course, however, if you'll remember that these three tiny fleas drain into the external jugular, then you'll be fine. Now the external jugular then drains into the superior vena cava, remember, by way of the subclavian and brachiocephalic veins, which I have omitted here for clarity. Now we can locate the vessels associated with the external jugular on the illustration. So here is your external jugular. Your temporal vein is right here. The maxillary vein then is below that right here. Your retromandibular vein is here. Now if I enlarge this area, then you can better see the retromandibular vein right here. You can see how the external and internal here jugulars have the retromandibular vein in common. And your occipital vein is right back here. So as before, I have included this flowchart as a PDF download in the resources section for this lecture. So let's now identify the divisions and subdivisions of the internal jugular. So our big flea here, remember, is the superior vena cava. Now working our way backwards this time, you know that the internal jugular drains into the superior vena cava by way of the subclavian and brachiocephalic veins, which again I have omitted for simplicity. So there are four branches of note here that drain into the internal jugular. So working from the bottom up then, we have the thyroid, which services the tissues of the thyroid, of course. We have the lingual, servicing the tongue. The facial vein, which has a number of branches that we'll identify in a moment. And the pharyngeal, or pharyngeal, servicing, of course, the area of the pharynx. Now, the branches of the facial vein that we'll identify here are the mental, which drains, of course, the tissues of the chin. The labial, servicing the lips. By the way, there is a superior labial and an inferior labial. The supraorbital, servicing the area above the orbit of the eye, and the frontal, which drains the tissue of the forehead. I also want to mention the series of vessels which service the tissues of the brain. Now they are referred to as dural sinuses, and they drain into the interior jugular vein by way of the sigmoid sinus. I mention them here and we'll examine them closer in the next lecture. So let's locate these veins on the model. So your internal jugular is right here. And by the way, your external jugular is right here. Now you can see how those two vessels drain into the subclavian vein here. The thyroid vein is here. Your lingual vein is right here. The pharyngeal or pharyngeal vein is just getting started right over here. Your facial vein is here. The labial branch of the facial vein is right here. And the supraorbital branch of the facial vein is right here. So checking out the frontal aspect here, we have the thyroid vein there. The lingual vein is right here, just before it ducts under the mandible. The facial vein is over here. Now, we don't see the pharyngeal vein in this presentation. The mental vein is here. Now remember that the mental vein is another branch of the facial vein. The labial vein is right here. The supraorbital is right here. Now, we don't see the terminus in this view. And the frontal vein right here, servicing the tissues of the forehead. By the way, in some sources, the frontal vein is also referred to as the supratrochlear vein. So here's your flow chart, again included as a PDF download in your resources section. So in the next lecture, the final circulation lecture, we will locate and identify the venous sinuses. So I will see you shortly for that.